The first cruelty of the season was meant to be delivered in a voice so low it could later be denied, but Marlena Vale heard every word. She stood 3 paces beyond the open library door, with a tray balanced against her hip, and the tray did not tremble, and her breath did not catch, and the polished silver of the small heirloom pin at her collar caught the corridor light without shivering. Because a woman who has been taught to serve tea to men who dislike her has already learned how to keep her hands still. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give them the satisfaction of a sound. Ashcombe Hall, in the winter of its 31st year of the new peace, was a house that leaned forward when it wished to hurt someone, and tonight it leaned. Beyond the tall doors the fire cracked once, an ember letting go of the log it had ridden all evening, and inside the room a man's voice, cultivated, unhurried, faintly bored, said the word useful as if placing a coin on a table he did not intend to pick up again. Useful, that was the assigned word. That was the small polished cage the house had built for her and dressed in silk so no one would see the bars. A useful girl. A useful cousin, a useful hand at the accounts, a useful head for the household ledgers, a useful memory for the names of tenants whose rents her uncle could not otherwise recall, a useful set of fingers to draft the letters her aunt disliked writing, and to correct the ones her aunt sent anyway. The corridor's long mirror across from the library returned to Marlena a young woman in a plain gray wool gown. Hair drawn back without ornament, the small silver pin at her throat the only glint on her person, and behind that reflection the closed line of her mouth, which had learned, over 5 winters and a summer, to hold its shape when the world called her useful and meant something meaner. She stepped back from the door. She did not withdraw, because she was afraid of being caught. She withdrew because listening any longer would require her to answer, and answering was a luxury the house had not yet granted her. She carried the tray down the corridor to the small parlor where her aunt liked to receive callers, and set it upon the console, and adjusted the cups so that the handles all faced the same direction, and did this without thinking. Because her hands had learned certain civilities the way another woman's hands learn a rosary. It was in the small parlor, alone for the width of a held breath, that she permitted herself the one honest gesture of the evening. She lifted her fingers to the pin at her throat. It was a plain silver oak leaf, no larger than her thumbnail, worn thin along the veining by a mother's thumb that had died before Marlena had learned to write her own name. It had been her mother's, and before that, her mother's mother's, and it was, in a house full of paste and glass and the loud jewelry of borrowed importance, the only object in the room that seemed to know her. Small things matter, her mother had said once, in a memory Marlena could no longer be sure had happened or had been assembled later out of longing. Small things matter, because a house is built of them, and so is a woman. 8 words, or 15 if one counted the second half, the sort of aphorism a woman utters over a task her hands are already performing, and Marlena had carried the sentence in her mouth like a stone one turns over with the tongue when one is trying not to speak. She let the pin go. She smoothed the front of her gown. She heard, from the library, the sound of chairs being pushed back, the low masculine laughter of men who had settled a small matter to their own advantage, and she went to the door to be ready for them, because that was what a useful girl did. It had been 5 winters since her father died, 5 winters and a scattering of months, and in that time, Marlena had come to understand a piece of arithmetic that no one in Ashcombe Hall had ever said aloud in her hearing, but that everyone in the house performed daily. The arithmetic ran thus: a daughter without a dowry was a debt. A daughter without a dowry who could keep books, write a clean hand, remember names, and hold her tongue in 3 languages was a debt that paid a small interest and could therefore be tolerated. A daughter without a dowry, who did all of that, and had, additionally, the misfortune to be quietly beautiful in a way that other women noticed before men did, was a debt that had begun, faintly, to accrue a second sort of interest, less easily collected, more easily resented. The arithmetic did not need to be written down. It was in the way her aunt's mouth tightened when a visiting gentleman glanced twice at Marlena instead of once. It was in the way her cousin Cyrilda touched her own throat when Marlena entered a room, as if to reassure herself that she still wore more than Marlena did. It was in the way her uncle, Lord Ashcombe, who was neither cruel nor kind, but merely tired, spoke of Marlena in the third person even when she stood in the room, as though describing a serviceable but slightly worn piece of furniture to a guest. The library door opened. Her uncle emerged first, thick-shouldered, wine-flushed, the loose collar of a man who had unbuttoned himself to friends. Behind him came Mr. Percival Halston, who had once, at a summer picnic on the lawns, called Marlena's handwriting exquisite in a voice that suggested he was surprised such a hand could belong to such a nobody. Behind Halston came the third man, whose name she did not need to hear because she had recognized the voice in the library and could not now unrecognize it. Colonel Rune Talbrook. Weaponized charm in a fitted coat. Golden, tall, overfavored by every drawing room within 20 miles, a man whom mothers forgave, and daughters excused, and rivals underestimated at their own expense. It was Talbrook who had called her useful. It was Talbrook who was in the habit of turning a barb into a compliment before the room could decide what it had heard, so that afterwards, when a woman went to her chamber and unfolded the sentence, she could not be sure whether she had been insulted or admired, and could not therefore complain. Her uncle saw her at the door and said, "Ah, Marlena, good, the tray," without looking at her face. Halston bowed at her, correctly, distantly. Talbrook, passing, smiled at her with the whole of his handsome mouth and none of his eyes, and said, softly, so that only she could hear, "So pleasant, is it not, to have someone always at the door," and moved on before she could answer, because he had not, of course, asked her anything. The word useful sat in her chest like a swallowed pin. She did not touch her throat. She did not follow him with her eyes. She poured the men's tea and refused the small burst of pleasure she felt when her hand did not shake, because pleasure at not shaking was a pleasure that admitted the possibility of shaking, and Marlena Vale had trained her hand not to admit anything at all. That night she sat at the little desk in her room beneath the eaves, where the ceiling sloped so low over the window seat that a taller woman would have struck her head against the beam, and she opened the ledger her uncle had given her 3 winters ago, with the words, "See if you can make sense of this, girl," and she did what she did every evening at this hour, which was to make sense of it. The ledger was in her uncle's original hand for the first 40 pages, and then, without announcement, it was in hers. She had never asked to keep the books. She had simply, one winter, corrected an error at the top of a column, and the next morning the ledger had been on her desk, and the morning after that a second ledger had joined it, and the morning after that her uncle had begun to speak of my accounts in the tone a man uses for a thing he has mastered. There was a small painting on the wall above her desk, a study of an oak leaf done in ink, the veins picked out with a fineness that had cost her 3 evenings of squinting by candlelight when she was 17, and could still permit herself the indulgence of drawing. She had not signed the study. There was, at present, no signed work of hers anywhere in Ashcombe Hall, because Cyrilda had a habit of finding Marlena's sketches and slipping them into her own portfolio, and Cyrilda's drawing master, a soft-voiced fraud from the county town, had a habit of praising the wrong girl for the right work. 3 summers ago, Marlena had made a study of the West Orchard in early bloom, careful, precise, the branches drawn as if she loved them, and Cyrilda's drawing master had held it up at a garden party and named Cyrilda a rare talent, and Cyrilda had laughed the small laugh she used for compliments she did not quite believe but intended to accept, and Marlena, standing at the edge of the lawn with a tray, had not corrected them. She had not corrected them, because to correct them would have required her to say, in front of her uncle, in front of Halston, in front of the county, that Cyrilda was a thief and their drawing master a fool, and a useful girl did not say such things at garden parties. She had, instead, walked to the edge of the orchard and stood for a moment in the shadow of a pear tree, and pressed the pad of her thumb against the veining of the oak leaf pin at her throat until the small silver ridge left a small silver ache in her skin, and she had told herself, quietly, that a thing did not stop being hers because someone else had put their name on it. She had believed that then. She still, on her better evenings, tried to believe it now. The ledger for the month of December showed a discrepancy of £11 and 6 shillings between the tenant's recorded payments and the rent book kept by the steward. Marlena found the error in half an hour, which was not a boast, but a fact, and traced it to an entry copied twice in the steward's hurry to be finished before Christmas, and made the correction in the small, clear hand her uncle had once called almost masculine, meaning almost worth reading. She wrote a brief note to the steward advising the correction, sealed it, and set it upon the salver for the Morning Post. She entered the correction in her private book as well, because she had learned at 18 to keep a private book, because a useful girl who did not keep a private book was a useful girl who could, if it suited a household, be blamed for other people's errors. No one saw her do it. That, too, was familiar. It was on the following morning that the world she lived in tipped in that small and unspectacular way in which worlds tip when a name is spoken. She was in the yellow parlor, seated by the long window, mending a lace edging that had come loose on her aunt's second-best fichu, when the front door was heard to open and a footman's murmur was heard to answer, and her aunt, from the far end of the parlor, set down her cup with the careful clink of a woman who had been waiting to hear this particular door open all morning. Cyrilda, from the sofa, straightened her spine so precisely that her curls rearranged themselves. Even the low fire seemed to correct itself. Marlena did not lift her head from the lace. She did not need to. She had learned to read a house by its behavior, and this house had just done something she had not seen it do before, which was to hold its breath. The Duke of Renhaven was announced. His name, spoken in the footman's steadiest register, moved through the parlor like a hand smoothing a cloth. Her aunt rose. Cyrilda rose. Marlena set her needle down along the seam of the lace, which was as much of a rising as her position permitted her, since the mending was not to be seen. She had not, until that morning, ever laid eyes on the Duke of Renhaven in the flesh. She had heard him named as one hears distant weather named, as a matter of consequence in a country one did not visit. He had, 3 winters ago, refused a marriage that half the county had assumed settled. He had, 2 summers ago, dismissed a steward of 40 years for an offense the county could not agree upon, and would not have dared to ask about. He was reputed to be exacting and cold and, in the phrase her uncle had once used with a small, unsteady laugh, a man in whose presence one remembered one's grammar. He entered the parlor. He was not, at first glance, what the county's whispers had prepared her for. He was tall, yes, and precisely put together in the sober way of a man who despised ostentation, dark coat, plain linen, no ornament at all, a single ring on the smallest finger of his left hand, and nothing else. His hair was dark and neatly cut. His eyes, when he lifted them to the room, were the color of a lake in winter, that gray which is almost blue, and cannot be trusted to stay either. He was not handsome in the way Colonel Talbrook was handsome. He was better than handsome. He was still. He stood in the doorway of the yellow parlor and did not shift his weight, did not smile in advance of being spoken to, did not sweep the room with the small, hungry glance of a man cataloging pretty faces. He looked at her aunt, who had begun her curtsy. He looked at Cyrilda, who had begun hers. He inclined his head, briefly, to each, and Marlena, who had lowered her eyes to the lace again out of habit, felt, without seeing it, the moment his gaze passed over the window seat and did not, as every other gentleman's gaze in 5 winters had done, slide off her, without registering. She lifted her eyes because it would have been rude not to. His attention had settled upon her exactly 1 heartbeat longer than the arithmetic of the room permitted, and then it moved on, and he was greeting her aunt in a voice so quiet that her aunt leaned forward 1/2 inch to hear him and did not seem to notice she had done it. Marlena's hand, on the lace, tightened once and released. Her aunt introduced her cousin. Wrenhaven bowed. Correctly, her aunt introduced her, second, in the manner one introduces a shelf. My husband's niece, Miss Vale, who lives with us. Wrenhaven bowed to her exactly as he had bowed to Cyrilda, which was not the smallest bow he owed a niece who lived with them, but the whole bow he owed a lady of a house, and Marlena, who had spent 5 winters being introduced as an item on an inventory, felt the second small tipping of her morning. She said, "Good morning, Your Grace," in the low, even voice she used for men whose reactions she did not intend to study, and she did not curtsy more deeply than was necessary, because a deeper curtsy to a duke was still a curtsy. And Marlena had promised her mother's memory that she would not lie with her body if she could help it. Wrenhaven, who had a great many things to attend to that morning, ought to have moved past her at once. He did not. He said, "Miss Vale," in a tone one used for a name one intended to remember, and then he did move on. He was in the parlor for 11 minutes. Marlena knew this because she counted the small chime of the mantel clock's quarter hour and observed that he arrived at 4 minutes past and departed at the quarter, and because counting was a thing her mind did when it did not know what else to do with itself. He addressed her aunt on the matter of a bridge over the river that divided his lands from her uncle's, which required, he said, the consent of both estates before the repair could go forward, and he spoke of costs and of engineers in a manner that assumed her aunt would not follow him, and did not condescend to explain when her aunt did not. Marlena, who had drafted last month's correspondence with the engineer in question, followed him perfectly. Twice, when her aunt paused to summon a phrase that she could not quite locate, Marlena's own mind supplied it at once, silently, from the ledger. And twice, in the fraction of a second before her aunt found the word or gave up on finding it and moved past it, the Duke of Wrenhaven's gray eyes touched Marlena's face and moved on. She did not permit herself to interpret it. She kept her hands on the lace. He rose. He bowed to her aunt. He bowed to Cyrilda. He turned toward the door, and at the door he turned again, briefly, and said, "Miss Vale," and Marlena lifted her eyes. "Good day," he said. She said, "Good day, Your Grace." He was gone. The door closed behind him. The house exhaled. Cyrilda, who had, throughout the 11 minutes, arranged her face into every expression a girl of 19 possesses for the reception of an unmarried duke, laughed, and the laugh was not the small musical one she used for compliments, but a hurried one, and she said, "Well, he was cold, was he not, Mamma? Colder than they said." Her aunt, who had been standing very still, said, distractedly, "Yes, dear, cold," and did not sit down. Marlena took up her needle. The lace was a very old piece, French, the sort of thing one no longer bought, and the tear along the edge had been done by someone impatient with fastening it, which was not, Marlena suspected, her aunt. She set the first small stitch. She did not permit herself to look at the doorway through which the Duke of Wrenhaven had passed. She noted, without deciding to note it, that the palm of her left hand was faintly damp, and that her breathing had changed by some small increment she could not have described in words, and that the word veil, as he had said it, had had in it neither pity nor amusement, nor the small conscious rise of a gentleman remembering to be gracious to a poor relation, and that this absence, more than any presence, had done something to the inside of her chest that she was not, at this hour of the morning, prepared to name. She stitched. She would tell herself later, before falling asleep, that she had imagined it. That evening at dinner, her uncle addressed the Duke's visit twice, once obliquely, in the manner of a man who intended his wife to raise the subject, and once directly, when she did not. He said, with the loose satisfaction of the second glass of claret, that Wrenhaven had been rather civil, considering, and had agreed to bear 2/3 of the bridge repair, which was more than they had hoped, and that the man was not, as some said, unreasonable, only remote. Her aunt allowed her mouth to soften, and said that his grace had been quite correct, and Cyrilda, who had spent the afternoon changing her sash 3 times, said one supposes he must marry eventually, and let the sentence lie upon the table. Her uncle laughed at that, kindly, and told his daughter not to be a goose, and then, in the same breath, told his wife that the county would talk if Wrenhaven's visits to Ashcombe should happen to become regular, and one could see, in the small shift of her aunt's shoulders, that this was not an unwelcome prospect. Marlena, at her end of the table, ate her soup. She was not, at this end of the table, part of any arithmetic that involved the Duke of Wrenhaven, and she did not intend to become one. She had learned, at 19, that a woman who did not step into other people's speculations was a woman who could not later be pushed out of them. She listened. She was, at Ashcombe, always listening. What she heard, beneath her uncle's satisfaction and her aunt's soft agreement, was a sentence her aunt did not say, and did not need to, which was that Cyrilda, at 19, unmarried, overpraised, underformed, was to be placed within the possible orbit of a duke, and that Marlena, at 23, useful, quiet, dowerless, was to be kept at the edge of the room, so as not to interfere with the placing. She did not, at this hour, mind. Cyrilda had been reared for exactly this hour. Marlena had been reared for the ledger. What she minded, though she did not put words to it even in her own head, was the memory of the way the Duke of Wrenhaven had said her name. It had not been the tone of a man who intended to place her at the edge of any room. It had been the tone of a man who had quietly, for reasons he had not disclosed, decided to put her name into his memory. She did not know what to do with that. She stitched, that night, until midnight, and did not open the ledger, and slept badly, and dreamed of an oak tree whose leaves fell one at a time onto a polished floor, while a room full of people pretended not to see them. In the morning she rose, dressed, and resumed. The following week brought the county's small autumn assembly at the Halston House, which was a room too large for the number of families that used it, and too small for the ambitions of the families that attended. Marlena had not intended to go. Her aunt required it. Cyrilda was to wear pale rose. Marlena was to wear the gray silk that had been her mother's last remaking of a gown of her own mother's, a garment 3 times taken in and once let out, which suited Marlena's coloring in a way her aunt did not choose to notice. Marlena wore the oak leaf pin, as always, at her throat. Cyrilda, glancing over her shoulder in the mirror as her maid arranged her curls, said, "Marlena, do take that little pin off. It looks so tired against the silk. One would think we had nothing better." She said it lightly. She said everything lightly. Marlena said, evenly, it was my mother's, Cyrilda. Cyrilda said, oh, well, and turned back to her mirror, and did not press the matter, because Cyrilda's cruelties were not those of a girl who wished to break a thing, but of a girl who wished to be seen to have offered to improve it. Her aunt, in the carriage, said nothing about the pin. She said, instead, Marlena, you will not, I hope, engage the Duke in conversation this evening, should he attend. It is not becoming. Marlena said, no, aunt. Her aunt said, and, if he addresses you, you will answer briefly and give the conversation back to me, or to your cousin. Marlena said, yes, aunt. Her aunt sat back against the squabs, satisfied. Cyrilda, beside her, adjusted her pale rose sash and did not look at Marlena, which was itself a form of speech. The Halston house that evening was warm, with too many candles and the smell of hothouse flowers, and the drawing rooms had been thrown together into one long room, whose ceiling was too low for the noise it was asked to hold. The county was there in its accustomed shape. Halston himself was at the door, bowing his correct distant bow, and Colonel Talbrook was already in the far corner, holding a glass of something amber and an audience of 3 young women who laughed at intervals so regular they might have been struck from a clock. And then, at 9, the Duke of Wrenhoven arrived. He came in without ceremony, in the plain dark coat he had worn to the yellow parlor, no ornament except the small ring on his smallest finger, and he did the thing rooms do when a certain kind of man enters them, which is that they arranged themselves around him without knowing they had done so. Voices dropped by half a register. A young man near the mantel unclasped his hands from behind his back and clasped them again in front. A dowager on the settee straightened without needing to. Colonel Talbrook, in the far corner, turned his smile up by 1 degree and did not lose his audience but had to work for them for the first time that evening. The Duke greeted his hosts. He greeted, correctly, the 2 elder ladies of the county. He was introduced to Cyrilda, whom he had of course met, and he bowed to her exactly as before, which Cyrilda, later, in the carriage home, would describe as marked attention, and which was in fact nothing of the kind. And then, standing in the middle of the long room with a hush that no one would have admitted was a hush around him, he asked Marlena's uncle a question which even her uncle, in the retelling, could not quite reproduce, because the question had been low and courteous and, in its content, entirely unremarkable, and yet in its effect it had done a thing that Ashcombe Hall would not stop feeling for a week. He asked if the elder Miss Vale might do him the honor of the second set. The elder Miss Vale. Not Cyrilda. Marlena, who had been standing beside a pillar at the far edge of the room, with a glass of watered wine she did not intend to drink, felt the room's attention arrive at her in a wave and continue past her to fix itself upon her aunt, upon her uncle, upon Cyrilda, and back, at last, to her. Her aunt's mouth did the small thing it did when displeased. Her uncle, taken by surprise, laughed his small, awkward laugh, and said, "Of course, your grace, of course, my niece," and gestured her forward with the reflex of a man who had been asked a favor by a duke and had not yet had time to decide whether it was one. Cyrilda's smile did not fall. Cyrilda's smile had been trained not to fall. It only, for the width of a breath, thinned. Marlena set her glass upon the small table beside the pillar. She crossed the floor with the same even step she used when carrying a tray past a full room. She did not lift her chin. She did not need to. She placed her hand in the Duke of Wrenhaven's gloved hand, which was warmer than she had expected, and did not close upon hers with any of the small proprietary tightenings men use to convey that a woman was, for the length of a dance, theirs. He let her out. The musicians, who had been waiting, began. He did not speak until the first figure of the set was completed, and she did not attempt to fill his silence, because a useful girl had learned that silence in men was rarely a hole waiting to be filled, and was more often a level being taken. When at last, at the return, he did speak, he said quietly, "Miss Vale, I owe you an apology." She lifted her eyes. He said, "I have put you in a position this evening which I did not think through in advance. I did not intend to make you a subject. I regret that I have." She was aware of the room watching. She was aware of her aunt's face at the edge of her vision, careful, cold. She was aware, most of all, of the fact that no man of consequence had in 5 winters apologized to her for anything, and that this one had done so before she had asked, and in a voice pitched so low that no one within 3 paces could hear it. And that this, too, was a discipline, a courtesy performed at the level of a whisper, because the alternative would have been to make her, again, a subject. She said evenly, "Your Grace, I am accustomed to being a subject." He did not smile. His eyes did the smallest thing. He said, "That, Miss Vale, is precisely what I regret." The figure of the dance took them apart. When it brought them back, he did not resume the sentence, and she did not either. They moved through the second and the third and the fourth figures in the silence of 2 people who had chosen the same silence for different reasons. And by the 5th figure, she was aware, in a way she did not intend, that the pressure of his gloved fingers upon hers had adjusted itself, once, very slightly, to the pressure of her own. And that this adjustment was not a proprietary tightening, but its opposite, an offer of space, an accommodation, so small that only a woman who had spent 5 winters counting the small tightenings of other men's hands could possibly have registered it. She registered it. She did not, in the moment, name it. When the set ended, he bowed. She curtsied, correctly, no lower than a duke was owed. He said, "Thank you, Miss Vale," and did not add anything to the thanks, and did not, as another man might have, ask for a second set. She would understand, later that night, alone at her window seat beneath the eaves, that he had not asked for a second set because a second set would have made her, again, a subject, and that this, too, had been a courtesy. She returned to her pillar. Her glass of watered wine was where she had left it. She did not, at once, take it up. She kept her hand loose at her side and felt the pulse in her wrist and permitted it, for the width of one breath, to be what it was, which was quick, and then trained it, in the second breath, to slow. Her aunt did not speak to her for the remainder of the assembly. Cyrilda did not speak to her either, except once, in passing, to say, in her lightest voice, "Well, Marlena, how kind of His Grace to be so charitable to the family." And Marlena said, softly, "Yes, wasn't it?" and did not add the sentence that formed, unbidden, behind her teeth, which was that charity was a word people used when they did not wish to say attention. Colonel Talbrook, in the far corner, waited until Marlena was near the refreshment table, and then arrived at her elbow, glass in hand, with the small conspiratorial angle of a man about to share an intimacy. He said, "Lo, so pleasant, Miss Vale, to see one's own family so warmly regarded." He said it with the whole of his handsome mouth and none of his eyes. He said it in front of 2 women who had turned, without pretending not to listen. He said it in the tone of a man who had, that morning, called her useful in a library. Marlena did not raise her voice. She looked at him with the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished floor, and she said, evenly, "Colonel Talbrook, I am so glad you find yourself equal to it," and turned her shoulder half a degree and let a passing footman refill a glass she did not intend to drink. The two women's smiles did the small thing polite women's smiles do when they wish to laugh and cannot. Telbrook's own smile did not fall. Telbrook's smile, like Cyrilda's, had been trained. It only, for the width of a breath, hardened. He inclined his head to her, murmured, "Miss Vale," and moved away. Somewhere in the far end of the long room, a laugh went up at a joke she had not heard. The musicians resumed. A footman refilled a lamp that had begun to gutter. The county resumed its evening as if a thing had not, quietly, been placed upon a table it had not previously held. Small things matter, her mother had said once. Marlena, at the edge of the refreshment table, with the ghost of a warm gloved hand fading from her fingers and the ghost of a cold golden voice fading from her ear, understood for the first time in 5 winters that this might, in either direction, be about to prove true. She did not move for a long moment. She only, unseen, lifted the pad of her thumb to the small silver oak leaf at her throat and pressed, once, until the veining left its small silver ache in her skin, and then she lowered her hand and turned toward her aunt across the room and prepared her face for the carriage ride home. The carriage ride home was conducted in the particular silence her aunt used when she did not intend to make an accusation, but did intend to be understood, and Marlena, who had long since learned to read that silence, sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed upon the small, dark square of window, and did not offer to translate herself. Cyrilda, opposite, arranged and rearranged the pale rose sash at her waist as if some final adjustment might yet redeem the evening. Her uncle at the far corner cleared his throat twice and did not speak. It was, in the end, her aunt who spoke, and she did not address Marlena directly, which was itself the sharpest form of address her aunt possessed. She said, into the middle of the carriage, that it was a curious thing, was it not, how a courteous gesture from a gentleman of standing could be misread by a household unaccustomed to such gestures, and that one must be careful, in the future, not to imagine that a duke's civility to a poor relation implied anything at all, since civility, she said, was to a duke what breathing was to another man, done without thought and meaning nothing. Marlena said, softly, "Yes, aunt," and did not add that a duke who breathed civilities without thought would not have apologized under his breath in the middle of a dance for having placed her in an unwelcome position, because the sentence was hers, and the memory of the sentence was hers. And she had no intention of surrendering either of them to the yellow parlor's arithmetic. Cyrilda, without lifting her eyes from her sash, said in her lightest voice, "One must not, of course, blame him. Mamma, he was only being kind, and one supposes he could see how she was standing there quite alone by that pillar." And Marlena felt the small polished cage close another latch. Alone, that was the new word, tucked in beside useful, small enough not to be argued with, and large enough to define her. She let it lie. She had learned at 19 that a word one did not fight kept its own weight, and a word one fought doubled it. At home, she climbed to her room beneath the eaves and did not light more than the single candle she carried, and she sat upon the window seat with her hands in her lap and looked out over the dark shape of the west orchard and permitted herself, for exactly the length of the candle's first inch, to remember the pressure of a gloved hand adjusting itself to hers. Then she snuffed the memory as one snuffed a wick, cleanly, and went to bed, and slept, and rose. In the morning the household resumed. The morning after that, it resumed again. By the 3rd morning, her aunt had recovered enough of her equanimity to send Marlena down to the village on a small errand about ribbons, which was her aunt's way of asserting, without saying it, that the elder Miss Vale was still the household's useful pair of feet, and not any other thing. Marlena took the errand. She walked the 1.5 miles down the lane in the cold, clean light of a November morning, and she did not think about the Duke of Wrenhaven, and when she found herself thinking about him, she thought, instead, about the ledger. And by the time she reached the village, her mind had returned to its ordinary shape. It was on the way home that she met him. He was on foot, alone, in a plain dark coat, walking the lane from the direction of the bridge that had been the subject of his visit to the yellow parlor. He was not, she understood at once, out for pleasure. He was walking a boundary. He carried a small leather notebook in his gloved hand and a pencil at rest against its cover, and his eyes, when they lifted to her at the bend of the lane, did the small thing they had done at the assembly, which was to register her precisely and then to release the registration back into the ordinary courtesy of a bow. "Miss Vale," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He did not step aside to let her pass. He did not, either, block her way. He stood, correctly, at the verge of the lane and inclined his head. He said, "I hope I do not detain you." She said, "Not at all, Your Grace." He said, "I have been looking at the bridge." She said, "I know." She had not intended to say, "I know." She said it because she had drafted the correspondence with the engineer, and because a woman who has drafted a correspondence knows a great deal about the man on the other end of it, and because in the small courteous pause after his sentence, she had understood that he was not the sort of man who would think less of her for admitting the knowledge. He tilted his head very slightly. He said, "Ah." He did not say, "How do you know?" He said, "Then perhaps you will tell me, Miss Vale, whether the engineer's second proposal, the one that reduces the arch by 4 feet, will hold against a spring flood." Marlena, who had thought about this exact question for 2 evenings in October, said evenly, "No, Your Grace, it will not." He said, "Why?" she said. "Because the flood in the 3rd year of the peace took out the old bridge at that same reduction, and the record is in the parish book at the church, and I have read it." He said, "Ah," again, but the second "ah" was different from the first, and she permitted herself, for the width of one breath, to notice the difference. He said, "And yet the engineer proposes it." She said, "The engineer proposes it because it is cheaper, Your Grace, and because he does not read parish books." He said, "Do you?" She said, "I do." He looked at her for a moment that was, by any measure of the lane, 1 moment too long, and then he inclined his head. He said, "Thank you, Miss Vale." He said, "May I write to your uncle upon this?" She said, "Please do, Your Grace, and add, if you will, that the correction should also be entered against the estimate of costs, which the engineer has, I believe, undercounted by £19. He almost smiled. He did not. He said 19, she said, and 6 shillings. He inclined his head again. He said, Miss Vale. She said, Your Grace. She walked on. She did not look back. She did not look back because the lane was straight for 1/4 of a mile from that bend, and because a woman who looks back on a straight lane is a woman who wishes to be seen looking, and Marlena had promised her mother's memory that she would not be seen wishing for anything she had not first earned. She heard, behind her, the small dry sound of a pencil against paper. He was writing something down. She did not know what. She reached the gates of Ashcombe with her hands cold, and her breath even, and her mind moving in the small, precise way it moved when it had been given a problem it liked. She entered the yellow parlor and reported, blandly, to her aunt that the ribbons had been secured, and she went up to her room beneath the eaves and opened the ledger, and did not, for the first time in 3 winters, find the ledger interesting. This, too, she noted and set aside. Over the next fortnight, the Duke of Wrenhaven came to Ashcombe twice on the business of the bridge, and each time he sat for the full 1/4 of an hour with her uncle in the small study at the back of the house, and each time, at the door, as he was leaving, he asked, in the tone one used for an afterthought that had not been an afterthought, whether Miss Vale might be spared a moment to answer a small question upon the parish record. Her uncle, who was flattered to be consulted at all, granted the moment with the loose satisfaction of a man distributing what was not his to distribute. Her aunt, present each time, made her face the small, careful shape of a woman who intended to be pleasant and was not. Cyrilda, present each time, made her face the small, brave shape of a girl who had been overlooked and intended not to complain. The moments in the study were, each time, exactly what the Duke had said they would be. He asked a precise question. Marlena answered it precisely. He wrote her answer into his small leather notebook. He thanked her, correctly, and left. He did not, in the study, look at her longer than the question required. He did not, in the study, lower his voice. He did not, in the study, adjust the pressure of anything at all against anything at all. The impropriety, if there was one, was located entirely in the fact that he had asked, and Marlena, who understood this perfectly, gave the study nothing to gossip about but the length of a bridge. And yet the county gossiped. The county always gossiped. By the second week, the Halston house had a story about the Duke of Wrenhaven's improbable interest in the parish records of Ashcombe. And by the third week, the story had grown a small tale, which was that the interest had been prompted less by the records than by the person consulted upon them. And by the fourth week, the tale had grown a small mouth, which was that the person consulted was, unfortunately, not the daughter of the house, but the poor relation, and Colonel Talbrook, who had never in his life met a story that could not be improved by his own mouth, took the small mouth and lent it his teeth. He did it, as he did all things, sweetly. He did it at dinners, and at card tables, and at the edge of a hunting lawn where his voice, pitched at the exact register the wind carried, reached 3 of the county's more industrious ears at once. He said, of the elder Miss Vale, in tones of admiring perplexity, that one must admire creativity in a woman of her position, since not every young lady in her circumstances would have thought to make herself so quietly indispensable. He said, of the Duke of Wrenhaven, in tones of dry protection, that a man of his Grace's standing could not be expected to see every angle of a courtesy, and that one hoped, for his Grace's sake, that the courtesy was not being taken up in quarters that might repay it with more than gratitude. He said, of the parish record, that one had heard the elder Miss Vale had rather a memory for figures, and that a memory for figures in a young woman of her means was a thing worth watching. Each sentence sounded affectionate. The pressure underneath them was not. Marlena, who did not attend any of the dinners or the card tables or the hunting lawn, heard the sentences arrive at Ashcombe in the flattened and softened forms in which such sentences arrive, from her aunt's mouth as a warning, from Cyrilda's mouth as a tease, from the housekeeper's mouth as a small confidential murmur delivered while unlocking the linen press. She received them without altering her face. She noted, at her desk in the room beneath the eaves, that the assigned word had grown a companion word, which was designing, and she turned the 2 of them over as one turned a coin, useful on one side, designing on the other, both of them meaning the same thing at Ashcombe, which was that a woman without inherited standing could not be trusted to have a merit of her own. She wrote, in her private book, on the first evening of the 4th week, one sentence which she did not underline and did not permit herself to reread, and the sentence was, "A word won does not fight, keeps its own weight, and a word one fights doubles it, and beneath it in a smaller hand, but a word one lets grow will feed on the household in which it grows." Then she closed the book and went down to dinner and passed the salt to her uncle without meeting his eyes. It was at the county's Advent gathering at the Halston house that the veiled duel was made public in a form even Marlena had not entirely anticipated. The gathering was smaller than the November assembly, close and warm and overflowered, the kind of evening at which the county performed its own coziness for itself. Cyrilda was in white with a green sash. Marlena was in the gray silk with the oak leaf pin. The Duke of Wrenhaven, invited as a courtesy that no one had truly expected him to honor, honored it and arrived at 9, and did not glance for Marlena as he entered, because he had learned, in the fortnight of visits to the study, that a glance for Marlena upon entering was a glance the county would harvest. He greeted his hosts. He greeted her aunt. He was drawn, correctly, into the circle at the fire, where Colonel Talbrook was already stationed, glass in hand, holding forth to 2 young ladies and a matron upon the improvement of country roads. Talbrook, seeing the Duke, made room without ceding ground. He smiled his whole mouth smile. He said, "Your Grace, one had begun to fear you had abandoned us to our own opinions." The Duke, correctly, said, "Colonel." Talbrook said, "We were just speaking of your bridge." The Duke said, "Ah," Talbrook said, "and of the surprising thoroughness with which certain of our neighbors have applied themselves to the parish record on your Grace's behalf." He said it lightly. He said it as if paying a compliment to a household. He said it in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to, and Marlena, standing at the edge of the room beside a tall potted fern that had been placed there to make the corner look furnished, felt the room's ears turn, softly, toward the fire. Her aunt's shoulder set. Cyrilda's smile did the small brave thing. The Duke of Wrenhaven did not turn his head. He did not, for a beat, answer. He waited, which was the more elegant form of correction, and let Talbrook's sentence finish its little journey around the fire and return to Talbrook slightly emptier than it had left him. Then he said in his low, even voice that he had found the parish record of Ashcombe to be maintained with a care that shamed his own, and that if the county had a habit of applying itself to public documents on behalf of its neighbors, the county was to be congratulated, since public documents were, in his experience, the first and last defense of ordinary people against the private opinions of powerful men. He did not look at Talbrook when he said it. He looked at the fire. The matron by the mantel drew in a small breath. One of the young ladies covered a laugh with a cough. Talbrook's smile did not fall. Talbrook's smile hardened again by the width of a breath. He said, "One hears you have been generous with your visits to Ashcombe." The Duke, still to the fire, said, "One hopes to be." Talbrook said, "And one hears the elder Miss Vale has been generous with her hours." The Duke turned his head. It was the smallest turn of a head Marlena had ever seen a man perform. He looked at Talbrook with the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished surface, and he said, softly, "Colonel Talbrook, I have not heard you speak of Miss Vale's hours before. Do you keep an account of them?" Talbrook laughed. "Correctly," he said, "Your Grace. One merely observes." The Duke said, "One may merely observe. One may not, however, merely publish." He said it with no lift of voice. He said it with the ring on his smallest finger catching the firelight for the width of a breath, and then losing it. He inclined his head to Talbrook. He turned back to the fire. The circle at the fire recomposed itself. The 2 young ladies looked at each other and did not, for a moment, know what to do with their faces. The matron sipped her ratafia. Talbrook, dispossessed of half his audience without having lost any of them, drank. Marlena, at the fern, did not permit her hand to lift to her throat. She did not permit her breath to change. She permitted, instead, the smallest interior sentence she had permitted herself all winter, which was that a man who used the word publish in a drawing room in that tone was a man who understood exactly what the room had been trying to do, and that he had chosen, for reasons she did not intend to name, to place his standing between it and her. She understood, also, that this was the notice her aunt had warned her not to accept. She understood, further, that it had not been offered for her acceptance. It had been offered for the county's education. She lowered her eyes to the fern. She would not, at this hour, meet his eyes. She had promised her mother's memory that she would not lie with her body, and to meet his eyes across the room would have been a form of gratitude she was not yet prepared to admit. Her aunt found her, 10 minutes later, by the refreshment table. Her aunt did not say anything about the fire. Her aunt said, in a tone thin as new ice, "Marlena, you will not, I hope, embarrass this family further this evening." Marlena said, softly, "No, aunt," her aunt said, "and you will remove that little pin. It draws the eye in that gown." Marlena said, evenly, "It was my mother's." "Aunt," her aunt said, "exactly," and turned away without waiting for the pin to be removed, and did not look at her again for the rest of the evening. Marlena did not remove the pin. She left the Halston house at midnight in the same silk and the same pin, and she rode home in the same silence, and she climbed to her room beneath the eaves, and she sat for a long time at the small desk with the ledger closed under her hand, and she permitted herself, for the length of an entire candle, to think. Small things matter, her mother had said. Small things matter, because a house is built of them, and so is a woman. She was, she thought, being built. She did not know yet what she was being built into. It was 3 mornings later that the letter came. She was in the yellow parlor with her aunt's fichu again, which had, in the interval, torn along a second edge. And she was setting the small, precise stitches when the front door was heard to open, and the footman's murmur was heard to answer, and the sound of the murmur was not the sound of an announced caller, but the sound of a delivered document, and her aunt, at the far end of the parlor, set down her cup with the careful clink she used for a thing she had been expecting. The document was brought to her uncle in the study. It was in the study for the space of 10 minutes. It emerged from the study in her uncle's hand, and her uncle's face was the color it went when a tenant had failed to pay, and her aunt rose without being summoned, and Cyrilda, on the sofa, straightened by an inch. Her uncle stood in the parlor doorway. He said, "Marlena." He said it in a voice she had not heard him use with her before, which was the voice of a man addressing a person whose position in the household had, in the last 10 minutes, changed. She set her needle down along the seam of the lace. She said, "Yes, uncle." He said, "Come to the study." She rose. She followed him. She did not, in the corridor, ask any question. In the study he closed the door, which he had never done for any of the Duke's visits, and he laid the document upon the desk with the small, careful pressure of a man handling a thing he did not wish to be seen to fear, and he said, "Read it." Marlena read it. It was an anonymous letter, penned in a careful, sloping hand, addressed to Lord Ashcombe as head of the family, and it accused, in the courteous vocabulary of the county, the elder Miss Vale of a course of conduct calculated to entrap the Duke of Wrenhaven into an engagement he had not sought, and would not, in his right mind, offer, it listed, in the small ordered paragraphs of a mind that had thought about the arrangement of its accusations. The visits to the study at Ashcombe, the private consultations upon the parish record, the meeting upon the lane, the second set at the November assembly, and, most damagingly, a series of letters said to have passed between Miss Vale and the Duke through the agency of the household steward, containing, the letter said, expressions unbecoming to an unmarried lady of any station and impossible in one of Miss Vale's. The letter enclosed, in evidence, a copy of one of these letters, in a hand which the writer of the anonymous letter had generously identified as Miss Vale's own. It requested Lord Ashcombe's assurance that the household would remove the elder Miss Vale from any further correspondence or contact with the Duke of Wrenhaven, and it noted, with the courteous menace of the county's better manners, that if such assurance were not forthcoming the writer would be reluctantly compelled to make the matter more widely known, in order that his grace might be protected from a designing hand. Marlena read the letter twice. She read the enclosed copy. Once, she set both down upon the desk. She said evenly, "Uncle, I have not written any letter to the Duke of Wrenhaven, and I have not passed any letter to him through the steward, and the copy enclosed is not in my hand." Her uncle, who had, in the 10 minutes in his study, prepared himself to be lenient, and then to be reluctant, and then to be firm, was not prepared to be told, calmly, that the document upon his desk was a lie. He said, "Marlena." She said, "Uncle, look at the copy." He looked at the copy. It was a fair sloping hand, a lady's hand, careful, the letters even, the loops moderate. It looked, to a man who had never troubled to read her handwriting, exactly like the handwriting of a young lady. He said, "It looks like a young lady's hand." She said, "Yes," she said, "but it is not mine." He said, "Prove it." She said, "Uncle, you have on your shelf every ledger of this estate for the last 3 winters in my hand." She reached, without waiting for his permission, and she took down the December ledger and opened it upon the desk beside the copy. Her hand, in the ledger, was clean and small and precise, the letters narrower, the loops disciplined, the numerals of a particular slant she had inherited from her father. The copy on the desk was rounder, larger, and its numerals leaned the other way. Her uncle stared at the two. Her uncle was not a clever man, but he was not a dishonest one either, and even he could see that the 2 hands were not the hand of one woman. He said, "This is a curious business." He looked up at her. He said, "Marlena, on your honor." She said, "On my mother's memory, uncle, I have never written a letter to the Duke of Wrenhaven, and I have never conducted any correspondence with him beyond the parish record, and I have never met him except in the yellow parlor, in your study, and once by chance upon the lane, and in the 2 assemblies of the county in the presence of all its witnesses." Her uncle sat down. Her uncle rubbed the bridge of his nose with the flat of his thumb. Her uncle said, "Then who has done this?" Marlena did not answer at once. She said softly, "Uncle, that is a question I would rather you asked than I." Her uncle did not for a moment understand her. Then he did. His face went the color it went at his second glass of claret, but for the opposite reason. He said, "Marlena, you do not mean." She said, "Uncle, I mean nothing that you have not already begun to see." He said, "But this is," she said, "this is a letter written to be believed." She said, "This is a letter written by a person who knows the household well enough to know that the steward has, in the past, carried private notes between certain persons of the county, and who knows that a copy in a lady's hand will pass, at first glance, for a lady's copy, and who has therefore imitated a lady's hand rather than mine, because whoever wrote it knew, quite well, that mine could be produced by any ledger on this shelf." Her uncle stared at her. She permitted herself, once, to lift her fingers to the oak leaf pin at her throat and let them rest there, and lowered them again. She said, evenly, "Uncle, I am asking one thing of you. I am asking you to write, at once, to my grandmother." Her uncle, who had been prepared to be many things that morning, had not been prepared for this. He said, "To your grandmother." She said, "Yes," she said, "my father's mother." She said, "Lady Ismen Veillet." she said, at the dower house at Marchand, 2 hours' ride from this door. Her uncle said, Marlena, your grandmother is. Marlena said, my grandmother is alive, uncle, and in possession of every one of her faculties, and she is the one person in this county whose word upon a matter of my honor will be believed by any drawing room that receives it, and I am asking you, as head of this house, to send for her. Her uncle looked at the 2 documents on his desk. He looked at his niece, whom he had known, without knowing her, for 5 winters, he said, at last, in a voice she had not heard him use with her before, either, which was the voice of a man beginning to understand that a piece of furniture in his study was in fact a woman. I will send today. She said, thank you, uncle. She turned. She went out. In the corridor, she did not permit herself to lean against the wall, though the wall was there. She walked evenly to the yellow parlor, and she took up the fichu, and she resumed the setting of the small, precise stitches, and when her aunt asked her, with a careful lightness that did not conceal the eagerness beneath it, what the letter in the study had said, Marlena answered, softly, that uncle would speak to her aunt about the letter when he wished to, and set another stitch, and did not look up. Her aunt did not press her. Her aunt did not press her because her aunt understood, in the small unspoken arithmetic by which she governed the household, that a niece who did not look up from lace at such a question was a niece who had, for the first time in 5 winters, taken back a fraction of ground, and that pressing her for it now would only cost more. Marlena set another stitch. In the study, behind the closed door, her uncle wrote to his mother-in-law. Lady Ismene Vale of Marchand arrived at Ashcombe Hall 2 days later, in a plain traveling coach, unattended by any maid, carrying only a small leather case and a walking stick, with a silver band worn thin at the grip. She was 74. She was tall and thin and upright, and her hair, which had once been very dark, was now the color of old iron, and she wore a black gown of a cut that had been fashionable when Marlena's father was born, and had never, since, been altered, because Lady Ismene Vale did not believe in altering a garment that had done what it was made for. She entered the yellow parlor without being announced, because she considered announcement a courtesy owed to strangers, and she looked at her son's widow's household in the small assessing way she had once looked at unrepaired fences on land she had inherited from her husband, and she said to her granddaughter, "Come here, child." Marlena rose. Marlena crossed the parlor. Marlena did not, for the first time in 5 winters, keep her hands loose at her sides. She permitted them, at last, to close on the small, dry, warm hands of the woman who had loved her father, and who had, at the funeral, taken her by the shoulders and said, in a voice like tarnished silver, "Small things matter. Marlena, remember that. Your mother said it, and it was true." Lady Ismene looked at her granddaughter's face. Lady Ismene said, "So, they have decided you are useful and designing, have they?" Marlena said, "Softly, grandmother, they have." Lady Ismene said, "Well," Lady Ismene turned to her son-in-law's wife and said, "Charlotte, I will require the study, and the letter, and the copy, and the ledger, and my granddaughter, and a pot of tea that has not been standing, and I will require them within the quarter hour." Her aunt said, "Mother-in-law, of course." Her aunt did not say anything else. Serelda, on the sofa, did the small brave thing with her face, and Lady Ismene did not look at her at all. In the study, with the 2 documents on the desk and the ledger open beside them, Lady Ismene did not, as her son-in-law had done, compare the hands from the top of the page. She did not compare them from the bottom either. She lifted the copy under the light of the study window and turned it 3 times, and she said softly, "Ah," Marlena said, "Grandmother." Lady Ismene said, "Come here, child." Marlena came. Lady Ismene said, "Look," she said, "look at the date." Marlena looked. The copy in the sloping lady's hand bore, at its head, in the same sloping hand, a date. The date was a Tuesday in October of the year then current. Lady Ismene said, "This letter says that Miss Vale wrote to His Grace on the 14th of October upon a matter of private feeling." Marlena said, "Yes," Lady Ismene said, "and the 14th of October in this year was a Tuesday." Marlena said, "Yes," Lady Ismene said, "and on the 14th of October in this year Miss Vale was where?" Marlena, who had spent 5 winters keeping a private book, said, quietly, "Grandmother, on the 14th of October in this year I was at Marchand with you." Lady Ismene said, "All day." Marlena said, "From the morning of the 12th to the afternoon of the 16th. Lady Ismene said, "And did you, on the 14th of October, at Marchand, write any letter to any duke of any kind?" Marlena said, "No, Grandmother," Lady Ismene said, "and was the household of Marchand, upon that day, occupied by any person who could have carried such a letter or received any reply?" Marlena said, "No, Grandmother, the household of Marchand upon that day was occupied by yourself, myself, your cook, your 2 maids, your gardener, and the vicar of Marchand, who dined with us at 3. Lady Ismene set the copy down upon the desk. Lady Ismene looked at her son-in-law over the top of the paper. Lady Ismene said, "Well, Robert, there it is." Her uncle said, "There it is." Lady Ismene said, "The writer of this document has done what liars do, which is to be too specific." Lady Ismene said, "A Tuesday in October is a small thing, is it not?" Lady Ismene said, "And yet it is checkable, and it does not check." Lady Ismene folded the copy in half with the small, precise pressure of a woman who had folded many things in her life and had learned not to crease what she wished to preserve. Lady Ismene said, "Robert, I will require you to summon, this afternoon, the writer of this document, or the person you now believe to have caused it to be written, to this study, in my presence, and I will require you to give the anonymous writer the courtesy of being named." Her uncle, who had spent 2 days not naming a person to himself, cleared his throat and said, softly, "Mother-in-law, I have my suspicions." Lady Ismene said, "Then act upon them." Her uncle said, "Colonel Talbrook has, of late, been a great deal at this house." Lady Ismene said, "Has he?" Her uncle said, "And Cyrilda, my daughter, has been, of late, in the habit of walking in the shrubbery with him." Lady Ismene said, "Has she?" Marlena did not, in the study, permit her face to move. She had known this. She had known this for a fortnight and had not permitted herself to look at it directly, because to look at it directly would have required her to acknowledge that her cousin, whose small cruelties she had absorbed for 5 winters as the price of a roof, had progressed from the borrowing of drawings to the manufacture of letters, and Marlena, at 23, had not been prepared, until this hour, to name that progression out loud. Lady Ismene said, "Evenly, Robert, summon them both." Her uncle said, "Mother-in-law." Lady Ismene said, "Robert, summon them both." Her uncle rose. Her uncle went to summon them. In the interval, Lady Ismene did not, as another grandmother might have, take Marlena's hand or say a kind thing. Lady Ismene stood at the study window with her back very straight and her walking stick planted before her, and looked out at the west orchard in its bare November shape, and she said, at last, without turning, "Small things matter." Marlena, who had not heard the sentence spoken in that voice since she was 10 years old, said, softly, "Yes, grandmother," Lady Ismene said. "Your mother said it." Marlena said, "Yes." Lady Ismene said, "It was true then, And it is true now, and it will be true, God willing, when you are the age I am now. And it will be true, because a house is built of small things, and so is a woman, and so is a lie, and so is the undoing of a lie, and the undoing of this one is a Tuesday in October, and you were at Marchand. And I will say so in any drawing room in this county that requires me to. Marlena did not, at the study window, cry. She had promised her mother's memory that she would not cry at a piece of good news that had not yet completed itself. She only, once, lifted her fingers to the small silver oak leaf at her throat and pressed, until the veining left its small silver ache in her skin, and lowered her hand, and stood, evenly, beside her grandmother, and waited for the door of the study to open. It opened, in the quarter hour, upon her cousin Cyrilda, who came in with the small, brave face of a girl who had been told her presence was required and had not been told why, and behind Cyrilda came Colonel Talbrook, who came in with the whole mouth smile of a man who had been told that Lord Ashcombe wished to consult him on a matter of the county's discretion, and who had not. Until he saw Lady Ismene Vale at the study window, understood that the matter was of a different kind. His smile did not fall. His smile was trained. It only, for the width of a breath, hardened, and Marlena, at her grandmother's side, permitted herself the smallest interior sentence she had permitted herself since the letter came, which was that a smile that hardened was a smile that had, at last, met a room in which it could not spend. Lady Ismene said, evenly, "Come in and close the door." They came in. They closed the door. Lady Ismene did not sit. Lady Ismene did not offer them a seat. Lady Ismene laid the anonymous letter and its enclosed copy upon the desk, and beside it the December ledger open at the page she had chosen, and she said, softly, "Colonel Talbrook, Miss Cyrilda, I have one question for you, and I will thank you to answer it plainly." She said, upon the 14th of October last, upon a Tuesday, in whose hand was this letter written. Cyrilda's face did the small brave thing. Talbrook's smile did the smallest thing. Neither of them, for a moment, spoke. The study was very quiet. Outside the study, in the corridor, a floorboard settled. In the yellow parlor, at the far end of the house, a door opened and closed. And, at that precise moment, before Talbrook or Cyrilda had drawn the breath by which either intended to answer, the footman came to the study door with the small, quiet knock he used for a caller he had not expected, and he said, through the door, in a voice pitched low, so that it would not carry my lord, "His Grace, the Duke of Wrenhaven, has ridden up to the front of the house, alone, and is asking to be received, and says the matter will not wait." Lady Ismene did not turn her head. Lady Ismene did not lift her hand. Lady Ismene said, softly to the closed door, "Tell His Grace that Lord Ashcombe is at present engaged upon a matter of his family's honor, and beg His Grace, in my name and mine only, to wait 1/4 of an hour in the yellow parlor, and to accept a pot of tea that has not been standing." The footman on the other side of the door said, "My lady." The footman's steps went away down the corridor. In the study, Colonel Talbrook's whole mouth smile did the smallest of its small hardenings, and Cyrilda's brave face did the small collapse a girl's face does when a girl has understood that the room she is standing in has not been arranged for her benefit. Lady Ismene said, again, evenly, upon the 14th of October last, upon a Tuesday, in whose hand was this letter written. Cyrilda opened her mouth. Cyrilda closed it. Cyrilda looked at Colonel Talbrook, and Colonel Talbrook, in the small, precise arithmetic of his own survival, did not look back. Lady Ismene said, "Colonel, I am 74, and I have not the leisure to inquire twice." Talbrook said, softly, "My lady, one hesitates to speak upon a matter one has only overheard." Lady Ismene said, then hesitate briefly. Talbrook said, "My lady, I have heard, at various tables in the county, that Miss Serilda has, of late, been much occupied with her drawing, and I would not, for the world, presume to say more. But a young lady of accomplishment can, in the ordinary course of practice, produce a great many hands." He said it with the whole of his handsome mouth and none of his eyes. He said it in the tone of a man laying a coin on a table he did not intend to pick up again. He said it, in short, with the small, precise gesture of a man who had, in the space of a single sentence, put a girl of 19 between himself and a grandmother of 74, and Marlena, who had watched him do the same thing to other women's daughters at other tables, permitted herself the single interior sentence that a woman is allowed to permit herself once in her life at the sight of a coward, which was that this one, at least, would find no purchase in this room. Serilda began, at that, to cry. She did not cry as her mother cried, decorously, into a folded handkerchief. She cried as a girl of 19 cries when she has discovered that the sash she has been arranging all winter has in fact been arranged around her own throat. She said, "Grandmother, I did not mean. He said it was only a game. He said it was only to help Mama. He said the Duke would never look at me while she stood by the pillar," he said. Her uncle, at the door, made a small sound. Lady Ismene said, "Softly, Serilda, look at me." Serilda looked. Lady Ismene said, "In whose hand was this letter written?" Serilda said, "Into the handkerchief her mother had, by reflex, put into her hand. In mine, grandmother, I copied it out. He wrote the words upon a slip and I copied them. He said the hand had to be a lady's. He said mine would not be known." Lady Ismene said, "And the date?" Serilda said, "He put the date." Lady Ismene said, "And you did not think of the Tuesday?" Serilda said, softly, "Grandmother, I did not know she had been at Marchand." Lady Ismene said, "No." Lady Ismene said, "Small things matter, Serilda, and it is the smallest of them that undo the largest of us, and you will remember this if you remember nothing else your grandmother has ever said to you in your life." Serilda, into the handkerchief, said, "Yes, grandmother." Lady Ismene turned her head, at last, upon Colonel Talbrook. Lady Ismene did not raise her voice. Lady Ismene said, "Colonel, you will oblige me by leaving this house within the hour, and you will oblige my son-in-law by never again crossing his threshold, and you will oblige the county by understanding that I have, in Marchand, a writing desk, and a great many correspondents, and that a Tuesday in October is not, henceforth, a thing you will wish spoken of in any drawing-room you enter." Talbrook, whose smile had by degrees thinned to a line, bowed, correctly, and said, "My lady." He did not, this time, add anything. He turned. He went out. He did not look at Marlena as he passed her at the study door, because he had, at last, understood, in the small, precise arithmetic of his own losses, that a woman he had called useful in a library in September was not, in November, a woman upon whom he could afford to spend even the length of a glance. The study door closed behind him. In the corridor, the small, unspectacular sound of his boots receded and did not return. Lady Ismene, at the window, said, "Softly, Robert, you will oblige your niece by writing to his Grace this evening, and by informing him of exactly the contents of this study for the last half-hour, and you will oblige your daughter by keeping her within the house for the remainder of the winter, and you will oblige me by having a fire built in the west sitting-room, because I intend, before I ride back to Marchand, to speak with his Grace myself, and I do not intend to do it in the yellow parlor, where the walls have ears." Her uncle said, "Mother-in-law." Her uncle said, "At once." Lady Ismene said, "And Marlena?" Marlena said, "Yes, grandmother." Lady Ismene said, "You will come with me." In the yellow parlor the Duke of Renhaven had, at Lady Ismene's message, accepted the pot of tea, and had not, from the look upon him when the door opened, drunk any of it. He was standing at the long window with his gloved hands loosely joined at his back, and he turned, at the sound of the door, with the small courteous inclination of a man who did not wish to seem to have been waiting, and Marlena, at her grandmother's side, understood, for the first time in her life, that a man can wait in a room in a way that is itself a form of speech. Lady Ismene said, "Your Grace." He said, "Lady Ismene." He said, "Miss Vale." Marlena said softly, "Your Grace." Lady Ismene said, "Your Grace, I have taken the liberty, since you have ridden here alone in weather that is turning, of ordering a fire built in the west sitting room, and of asking Lord Ashcombe to attend upon us there in a quarter of an hour, and I will thank you to come with us, because what I have to say to you is not to be said within 20 feet of a footman." He inclined his head. He said, "My lady, I am at your service." In the west sitting room, where the fire had just been built and had not yet ceased to smoke, Lady Ismene sat, without waiting to be seated, in the high-backed chair beside the hearth, and she planted her stick before her, and she said, "Your Grace, I will be brief." She said, "My granddaughter has, this week, been the subject of an anonymous letter written to her uncle upon a Tuesday in October, which she spent in my house, in my company, and I have, in the study, satisfied myself of the identity of the writer, and I have, in the study, dismissed the writer from this house, and I will, from Marchand, satisfy the county upon the matter, and I will not, Your Grace, require anything of you at all." He said softly, "Lady Ismene, may I see the letter?" She said, "Of course." She rose and went into the corridor and returned with the 2 documents and laid them upon the small table beside his chair, and she stood at the fire and warmed her hands, and she did not watch him read. He read. He read the anonymous letter through once, and he read the enclosed copy once, and he set them down. And he lifted his eyes to Marlena, who was standing at the window with her hands folded before her, and he said, in a voice that was so quiet the fire had, for a moment, to be the loudest thing in the room, Miss Vale, "I am sorry." She said, evenly, "Your Grace, you did not write it." He said, "No." He said, "But I permitted its occasion." He said, "I permitted it by asking after the parish record in a household in which my asking was noticed, and by walking a lane upon which my walking was seen, and by standing at a fire in a drawing-room in which my standing was harvested, and by not marrying, these last 3 winters, any of the women the county chose to place upon my path, and thereby making of every young woman I addressed a subject, and I have known this, Miss Vale, since the November Assembly, and I have, until now, been coward enough to prefer the pleasure of your company to the cost of what my company brought upon you." Marlena, at the window, did not turn her head. She said, softly, "Your Grace, that is a great deal of blame for a single letter." He said, "No, Miss Vale, that is exactly the amount." Lady Ismene, at the fire, did not turn either. Lady Ismene said, "Your Grace, I will leave you to the room for the space of a quarter of an hour, and I will send my son-in-law in at the end of it, and I will be, at that time, in the small study across the corridor, and I will not be listening at any door, because I do not consider it my place. Your Grace." Marlena, she rose. She went out. The door closed. Marlena did not, for a long moment, turn from the window. Outside the west sitting room the November afternoon had gone gray, and the wind had lifted the branches of the west orchard, and the first hard rain of a coming storm had begun to strike the panes in the small driveway rain strikes at the beginning, before it becomes weather. He said softly, Miss Vale, will you sit? She said, Your Grace, I would rather stand. He said, Then I will stand. He crossed the room. He did not cross it all at once. He crossed it in the small measured increments a man crosses a room when he has understood that a woman at a window may, at any distance, be a woman at an edge. He stopped, first at the small table where the letters lay. He stopped, second, at the fire, and warmed his hands. He stopped, third, at a chair 3 paces from the window, and rested his gloved hand upon its back, and did not sit. He said, From the chair, Miss Vale, I did not come to Ashcombe this afternoon to speak to your uncle. He said, I came because at midday I received a letter of my own, delivered to me by a groom of Colonel Talbrook's, which contained an accusation against you so poorly composed that I read it twice merely to be sure I had understood it, and which was intended to reach me before your uncle's messenger could, and which failed, because your grandmother's coach, Miss Vale, was seen at the crossroads at 11, and I did not, as the writer of that letter hoped, ride here to demand an explanation of your uncle. I rode here to make one. She turned at that from the window. She said, softly, Your Grace, an explanation of what? He said, of 5 months. He said, of a September morning at which I was announced in this house upon the business of a bridge, and at which I did not, in fact, come upon the business of a bridge, because the bridge was decided in July, and could have been decided by letter, and I had chosen, instead, to be announced, because a lady of the county had been described to me, at a house in London, by a woman of my mother's acquaintance, in terms so precise and so unbecoming, and so evidently intended to warn me against her, that I could not, in honor, refuse to satisfy myself as to the woman they described. She said, Your Grace. He said, Miss Vale, I have spent 5 months satisfying myself as to the woman they described, and I have not, in that time, found her. She said, softly, Your Grace. He said, I have found, instead, a woman who reads parish records, he said. I have found a woman who corrects an engineer by £19 and 6 shillings. He said, I have found a woman who stands beside a fern in the corner of a drawing room and refuses to give a scoundrel the satisfaction of a raised voice. He said, I have found a woman who wears at her throat a plain silver pin worn thin by her mother's thumb, and who does not remove it at her aunt's request, and who does not, in 5 winters at this house, sign a single sketch, and who does not, when accused, weep, he said. I came here today because at midday I understood, at last, that the woman they had described to me in London was not you, and could not be you, and had been described to me in the hope that I would never trouble to know you, and that I had, by not marrying any of them, become an inconvenience which they proposed to solve by inventing you into their arithmetic. He said, Miss Vale. He said, I am not proposing that arithmetic. He said, I am proposing, instead, if you will have me, to spend the remainder of my life outside of it. She said, softly, into the small hard rain against the pane, Your Grace. He crossed the last 3 paces. He did not touch her. He stopped exactly 1 pace from her, at the edge of a distance that was not a distance the county had a word for, and he said, Miss Vale, I am not asking because your family has been slandered. I am not asking because a man of my standing owes a woman of yours the courtesy of a repair. I am not asking because I have discovered, in the small, ordinary calculation of a man about to inherit his father's title fully, that you would make an admirable duchess. I am asking, Miss Vale, because I have, for 5 months, wanted you when no one was watching, and because that is the only reason a man of any honor should ever ask a woman anything, and because I have, until this afternoon, been coward enough to pretend that the other 3 reasons would do. She did not at once answer. She had promised her mother's memory that she would not lie with her body, and she had promised her mother's memory, further, that she would not answer any large question with any small breath. And she stood, evenly, at the window with the small, hard rain of a coming storm against the pane behind her, and she permitted for the width of one honest breath. The interior sentence she had refused herself all winter, which was that this man had crossed a room in measured increments in order not to frighten her, and that this was the first courtesy of his kind she had ever been offered, and that a woman who did not, at such a moment, take a further breath before she spoke, was a woman who had not earned the answer she intended to give. She took the breath. She said, softly, "Your Grace, I will not answer you tonight." He did not, at that, step back. He did not step forward. He said, evenly, Miss Vale, "I did not expect that you would." She said, "Your Grace." She said, "I have in this house been called useful, and I have in this house been called designing, and I have in this house been called alone, and I have not, in 5 winters, given any of those words the satisfaction of a fight." She said, "I have carried them, because to carry them was to prove that they weighed nothing." She said, "And if I answer you tonight, Your Grace, I will not tomorrow know whether I answered you because I wished it, or because I was, at last, afraid of carrying them another winter." She said, "And I have promised my mother's memory that I will not lie with my body, and answering you tonight, upon the strength of this afternoon, would be, Your Grace, a lie." He said, softly, Miss Vale, he said, "I am, if anything, more in your debt for that answer than I would have been for any other." She said, "Evenly, Your Grace, I would rather you were not in my debt at all." He said, "Then I will be, instead, at your service, and I will ask you again, Miss Vale, at any hour you choose, and I will ride, if it pleases you, to Marchand, and I will ask you there, in your grandmother's parlor, and I will ask you in fair weather, when no fire is smoking and no rain is striking any pane, so that neither of us will be able, afterwards, to attribute the answer to the weather." He said, "And until you answer, I will conduct the business of this county upon the bridge as if I had never entered this room, and I will not, in any drawing room of the county, speak your name in a tone that requires the county to gossip." She said, softly, Your Grace, "Thank you." He inclined his head. He turned. He crossed the room, and at the door he turned again, briefly, and said, "Miss Vale, one thing." She said, "Your Grace." He said, "In whatever answer you come to, will you not, upon my account, remove the pin?" She said, "Evenly, Your Grace, I would not have." He opened the door. He went out. In the corridor, Lady Ismene's stick could be heard against the floor, moving, at his footstep, without haste, from the small study across the corridor into the yellow parlor, so as to leave the corridor clear for him without giving the appearance of having withdrawn from it. He rode out into the rain. Marlena, at the window, permitted herself, for the first time in 5 winters, one dignified, cathartic cry, the sort of cry that is not collapse but truth reaching the surface, and it lasted the length of 1 breath in and 1 breath out, and it left her face wet and her hands steady, and when Lady Ismene, in the yellow parlor, called for her in the small dry voice a grandmother uses when she has decided to allow her granddaughter a private moment and no more, Marlena wiped her face with the back of her hand and went. Lady Ismene did not ask her what she had said. Lady Ismene said, "Only, Marlena, in fair weather." Marlena said, softly, "Yes, grandmother, in fair weather." Lady Ismene said, "Then it will be at Marchand." Marlena said, "Yes," Lady Ismene said, "Then we will go tomorrow." Marlena said, "Yes," Lady Ismene said, and you will bring the ledger, because I have a mind this winter to teach you to read the ledgers at Marchand, since they have been kept, these last 2 years, by a steward whose numerals lean the wrong way." She said it evenly. She said it with the small, dry warmth of a woman who had, at 74, decided that she had waited long enough to teach her granddaughter what she had, in her son's daughter, been quietly preparing to teach. Marlena said, softly, "Thank you, grandmother." Lady Ismene said, "Small things matter, child." Marlena said, "Yes, grandmother, it was, in fact." The following March, before the Duke of Wrenhaven rode to Marchand and asked her again, in the small parlor of the dower house, in fair weather, with no fire smoking and no rain striking any pane. And it was upon that afternoon, in the plain light of a spring, in which the west orchard at Ashcombe had begun to bloom, and the anonymous letter of the previous November had, by the small dry industry of Lady Ismene Vale's correspondence, become in the county's mouth a story with only one possible teller and only one possible cause, that Marlena Vale gave him her answer. He said, in the small parlor, "Miss Vale, will you have me?" She said, softly, "Your Grace, I will." He said, "Miss Vale." She said, "Your Grace, I will have you, not because you have crossed a rainy afternoon to a west sitting room, and not because you have written, this winter, 3 letters a fortnight to my grandmother's house, and not because the county has at last understood that Colonel Talbrook is not a man in whose drawing room one is safe." She said, "Your Grace, I will have you because I have, this winter, wanted you when no one was watching, and because that is the only reason a woman of any honor should ever answer any man anything." She said, "Yes, because I wish it." He crossed the small parlor. He took her hand. He did not let it go. In the corridor, Lady Ismene's stick did not, for once, move at all, because Lady Ismene, in the small study across the corridor, had, without any ceremony, closed her eyes and was, for the first time since her son had died, weeping in the small dry way an old woman weeps for a thing that has, at last, come out right. They were married at Marchand, in the small parish church, in the last week of April, and Lady Ismene gave Marlena away. And Marlena wore, at her throat, the plain silver oak leaf pin that had been her mother's, and her uncle stood at the back of the church, and Cyrilda, who had been kept within the house for the whole of the winter, and who had, in that keeping, done the smaller and slower work of becoming, at last, a person whose face did not do the brave thing when she was frightened, sat in the 3rd row with her mother, and did not cry, and did not laugh, and did, at the end, when Marlena passed her upon her husband's arm, lift her eyes and offer her cousin a look that was not a smile, but was, for the first time in 5 winters, only itself. 2 years later, in the 2nd summer after the wedding, the west orchard at Ashcombe was, by a small clause in a settlement Lady Ismene had written into the marriage contract, with the small dry patience of a woman who had known exactly what she was writing, planted new upon the design Marlena had drawn as a young girl in ink upon paper. The veins of the leaves picked out in the fineness that had once cost her 3 evenings by candlelight, and the trees, when they came into bloom in the arrangement she had drawn, and the county came, at midsummer, upon the invitation of the new Duchess of Wrenhaven, to the opening of a small school beside the orchard, endowed by her husband in her name, for the daughters of tenants and of tradesmen, and taught in its first 2 years by a mistress Marlena had chosen herself, upon the recommendation of the vicar of Marchand, upon whose recommendation Lady Ismene had, without ceremony, staked her own. It was upon that midsummer afternoon, in the small paved yard between the school and the orchard, with the tenants and the tradesmen and their wives and their daughters gathered upon the grass, and with her uncle standing near the gate in the loose, flushed satisfaction of a man who had, at last, understood that he had been distributing a thing that had not been his to distribute, and with her aunt beside him in a soft gray silk that did not, in the summer light, insist upon anything. And with Cyrilda, 23 now, standing beside her mother in a plain white gown with no sash at all, and with Lady Ismene, 76, and upright in her old black gown at the front of the crowd, with her stick planted before her, and with the branches of the newly planted orchard lifting in a small clean wind, that the Duke of Wrenhaven addressed the county. He did not stand upon any platform. He stood at the small stone step of the schoolhouse door, and he waited, without any lift of his hand, for the crowd to still. And the crowd, in the manner of crowds who have understood at last, who has been standing among them for 2 summers, stilled, he said, in the low, even voice he had used at the fire at the Halston house in November of the year of the anonymous letter, that he had, upon the occasion of this school's opening, a debt he wished, in the hearing of the county, to acknowledge. He said, "This school stands upon a design drawn, in ink, by my wife, when she was a girl of 17 in a house whose corridors did not know her name." He said, "This orchard is planted upon a plan drawn, in the same ink, by the same hand, in the same house, upon which no signature was permitted, and for which the credit was, at a garden party of which many of you here today have the memory, given to another." He said, and I will say it plainly, because plainness is what this school is here to teach. He said, "They were wrong." He said it without lifting his voice. He said it, in fact, exactly at the register he had used to say the word publish, and the county, which had, upon that November evening, harvested the register, harvested it now, and did not for a moment breathe. He said, "They were wrong about her name, which is Marlena, and which is a name I have watched a household refuse to speak in 5 winters, and have not seen it lose any of its shape." He said, "They were wrong about her worth, which is not, and has never been, a matter of what she was permitted to sign, but of what she was, in fact, doing while others signed." He said, "They were wrong about her voice, which is quiet, and which they mistook, in the small vain habit of the county, for absent, and which is not absent, and has not been absent in any room I have ever seen her stand in, and which is the voice, from this day forward, of the mistress of this school, and of the orchard beyond it, and of a great many small things by which, God willing, this county will, in the next 30 years, be built." He said, and I will say as well that the design of a girl of 17, tolerated in a room in which she was not permitted to sign, has become, in the plain summer light of this afternoon, the design of a woman who has been believed in, and I will say, further, that she was always worth believing in, and that the fault, from first to last, was in the eyes of those of us who did not, until we were made to. Look, he said, and I will say finally, upon the day of the opening of a school for the daughters of tenants and of tradesmen, that it is my hope, and my wife's, that no daughter of this county, from this day forward, will ever be described, in her own house, by a word she did not choose. Applause broke. It was not the polite, qualified applause of a drawing room. It was the applause of tenants and of tradesmen and of their wives and their daughters, and it was, at Ashcombe as at Marchend, genuine. And it lasted until Marlena, at his side, lifted her fingers once to the small silver oak leaf at her throat and lowered them again, and until Lady Ismene, at the front of the crowd, permitted her stick, for the first time in 76 years, to lean slightly to one side, and until the small clean wind in the west orchard took up the sound of it and carried it, through the branches of a design drawn in ink by a girl of 17, into the summer afternoon. That night, the storm broke over Ashkam. It came in from the west, off the sea, in the way the great summer storms of that country came in, low and slow and full of light, and it lasted the whole of the small hours, and it lashed the panes of the west sitting room, in which, in the November of the year of the anonymous letter, a duke had crossed a room in measured increments to a woman at a window. And it lashed the small parish church at Marchend, in which, in the April of the following spring, that woman had answered him. And it lashed through the branches of a newly planted orchard the small paved yard of a schoolhouse, whose door bore a plain silver oak leaf carved into the wood above the lintel at Marlena's quiet request. And in the small hour before dawn the storm passed. It went out, low and slow, over the eastern hills, and the wind dropped, and the rain thinned, and the first gray of morning came in at the tall window of the room in which Marlena Vale, now Marlena Wrenhaven, stood in her nightgown with her husband at her side, watching the west orchard emerge, wet and bright and unhurt, into the plain dawn light of the morning after a storm. He said, softly, at her side, small things. She said, softly, matter. He said, your mother. She said, my mother. He took her hand. He did not let it go. In the west orchard below the window, a bird began, and another answered, and beyond the orchard the roof of the small schoolhouse showed, wet and dark above the trees, and beyond the schoolhouse the road to Marchand showed, wet and pale, going away between the hedges toward Lady Ismeen's dower house, in which, at this hour, a 76-year-old woman had, without ceremony, opened her eyes upon a morning she had, in the November of the anonymous letter, decided she would live to see. Marlena did not, at the window, cry. She had, in the west sitting room in November, spent the only cathartic cry a woman of her discipline was ever likely to spend upon a single afternoon, and she had, in the years since, come to understand that the truth, once it had reached the surface, did not, thereafter, require any further surfacing. She only, once, permitted her fingers to lift to the small silver oak leaf at her throat and press, until the veining left its small silver ache in her skin, and lowered them again, and turned her hand within her husband's and closed her fingers upon his, and did not let his hand go. It was not perfect. It was not easy. It was, simply, shared. And that, in the plain gray dawn of the morning after the storm, at the tall window of the west sitting room at Ashcombe Hall, with the wet bright branches of a newly planted orchard lifting into the first light, and with a small silver oak leaf worn thin by a mother's thumb resting at her throat, and with her husband's hand in hers and hers in his, and with neither of them moving toward the threshold and neither of them turning from the window, was more than enough.